in a small African town called Iko, where the sun painted golden hues over the dusty roads, lived a bright and kind-hearted girl named Masego. She was the light of her father Banele's life, especially after they lost her mother at a young age. Despite the pain of her mother's passing, Masego held on to hope, believing that happiness would find its way back to their home. Not long after, Banele remarried a woman named Sindiswa, bringing her daughter Kanya into their lives. Masego, eager to welcome her new family, dreamed of having a loving stepmother and a sister to share her joys and sorrows with. But from the very start, Sindiswa's heart was filled with resentment. She looked at Masego, not as a daughter, but as an outsider, a burden. And with that, Masego's days of warmth and love slowly began to fade. Life in Iko changed completely for Masego after her father remarried. At first, she had tried to be happy about his decision. She told herself that maybe Sindiswa would love her as a daughter, and maybe Kanya would be the sister she always wished for. But it didn't take long for her dreams to shatter. Sindiswa didn't see Masego as family. She saw her as a problem, something that needed to be erased. It started with small things. Sindiswa would serve Kanya extra food, while giving Masego just able to get by. When Masego spoke, Sindiswa would roll her eyes, or act as if she wasn't even there. Slowly, the warmth of a mother's love that Masego had longed for turned into cold silence and harsh commands. But the worst part was how Sindiswa turned Banele against his own daughter. She didn't yell at Masego in front of him. No, Sindiswa was too clever for that. Instead, she acted sweet whenever Banele was around, pretending to care for Masego while secretly filling his ears with lies. "She doesn't respect me," Sindiswa would say with fake sadness. "She never listens, Banele. I try to love her, but she pushes me away." Banele, tired from work and blinded by Sindiswa's words, started believing her. Slowly, he became distant from Masego. The father who once carried her on his shoulders and told her bedtime stories now barely looked at her. When she tried to sit with him, Sindiswa would call him away. When she spoke to him, he would sigh as if she was a burden. Masego's heart ached. She couldn't understand what she had done wrong. She missed her father's warmth, his laughter, his love. But no matter how hard she tried, she couldn't bring him back from the web of lies Sindiswa had spun around him. As days passed, Sindiswa's cruelty grew bolder. She began treating her own daughter, Kanya, like a princess while turning Masego into a servant in her own home. "Masego, wash the dishes. Masego, sweep the yard. Masego, why are you standing there? Go clean Kanya's shoes." Day and night, Masego worked like a slave while Kanya sat comfortably, eating the best food, wearing the prettiest clothes, and enjoying all the love Masego longed for. Kanya, spoiled by her mother, took full advantage of it. She would purposely spill juice on the floor just to watch Masego clean it. She would laugh when Sindiswa scolded Masego for no reason. Masego never fought back. She wanted to. Oh, how she wanted to scream and ask why. Why was she being treated like this? Why did her father not see what was happening? But she knew if she spoke, things would only get worse. So, she swallowed her pain, forced a smile, and did what she was told. But at night, when everyone was asleep, Masego let herself cry. Silent tears soaked her pillow as she hugged herself tight, wishing her mother was still alive. She longed for her gentle touch, for the way she used to sing to her when she was scared. But her mother was gone, and now she had to face this nightmare alone. Still, Masego refused to let Sindiswa break her spirit. Even when her body ached from all the work, she held on to hope. She told herself that one day things would change. One day her father would see the truth. One day she would be free from the cruelty of Sindiswa and Kanya. And until that day came, she would endure. Because deep inside her, there was a fire, a quiet but unbreakable strength. A strength that even Sindiswa's hatred could never destroy. Masego had always been a bright girl. She loved learning, asking questions, and dreaming of a future where she could make something of herself. But as the days passed in her stepmother's house, her dreams began to slip further and further away. Sindiswa's cruelty, which had once been hidden behind fake smiles and whispered lies, now grew into something darker, something that no longer needed to be disguised. It started with punishments for the smallest mistakes. If Masego accidentally spilled water while cleaning, Sindiswa would slap her hands and make her scrub the floor until it shone. If she was too slow in bringing Kanya's shoes, Sindiswa would snatch away her food, forcing her to go to bed hungry. There was never a reason, never a warning, just endless ways for Sindiswa to remind Masego that she was unwanted. But the worst punishment of all came one morning when Masego was getting ready for school. She had just packed her books when Sindiswa stood in front of the door, arms crossed, a wicked smile on her face. "You won't be going to school anymore," she said coldly. Masego's heart dropped. "But why?" she asked, her voice trembling. Sindiswa scoffed. "Because I said so. You think you deserve an education. School is for important children, not for useless girls like you." Tears welled in Masego's eyes, but she refused to let them fall. She turned to her father, who sat quietly at the table, his eyes fixed on his plate. She wanted him to say something, to fight for her, but he didn't. He simply sighed, as if the matter didn't concern him, and continued eating. Masego felt her world shatter. School had been the one place where she could escape, where she felt like she mattered. Now, even that had been taken from her. Meanwhile, Kanya continued going to the best school in town, dressed in the finest uniforms, carrying expensive books, and talking excitedly about her future. Masego, on the other hand, was trapped. Instead of solving math problems and reading stories, she spent her days scrubbing floors, washing clothes, and cooking food she barely got to eat. The books she once loved gathered dust in a corner, forgotten. Her nights were the hardest. She would stare at the moon through her tiny window, wondering what she had done to deserve this life. Had she been cursed? Had she been born unlucky? Or was she simply invisible, forgotten by the world? But even in her pain, Masego found a small light: Mama Lethabo. Mama Lethabo was an old woman who lived down the street, known for her warm smile and wise words. While the rest of the neighborhood turned a blind eye to Masego's suffering, Mama Lethabo saw everything. One afternoon, when Masego was sent to fetch water, she passed by Mama Lethabo's house. The old woman was sitting on her porch, her kind eyes filled with concern. "Come here, child," she called softly. Masego hesitated, afraid Sindiswa might see, but something about Mama Lethabo's voice made her feet move forward. She stepped closer, and before she knew it, she was wrapped in a warm embrace. It was the first hug she had received in years. "You are stronger than you know," Mama Lethabo whispered. "Do not let their cruelty steal your spirit." Masego finally let her tears fall. She didn't say a word. She didn't have to. Mama Lethabo understood. From that day on, Masego found comfort in the old woman's presence. Whenever she could steal a moment, she would visit Mama Lethabo, listening to her stories and soaking in the warmth she was so desperately missing at home. Mama Lethabo became her only friend, the only person who reminded her that she was not worthless, that she mattered. But deep down, Masego knew that kindness alone would not save her. Sindiswa's hatred was growing stronger, and she feared that one day it would swallow her whole. Life in the house had always been hard for Masego, but when her father fell sick, things became even worse. Benele, once a strong and hard-working man, grew weak and tired. He no longer left for work, spending most of his time in bed, coughing and shivering. The father who had once smiled at her now barely had the strength to speak. Masego wanted to take care of him, to sit by his side and make him feel better, but Sindiswa didn't allow it. "Stay away," she snapped whenever Masego tried to check on him. "He doesn't need you." With Benel too weak to make decisions, Sindiswa was now in full control of everything: the house, the money, and most importantly, Masego's future. One evening, as Masego was washing dishes, she overheard Sindiswa talking to someone in the kitchen. "I need to make sure that girl is gone," she whispered, her voice filled with hatred. "If Benele dies, she might try to take what belongs to me and my daughter. I won't let that happen." Masego's hands froze. Her heart pounded in her chest. She wasn't sure what Sindiswa meant, but one thing was clear: she was in danger. Sindiswa had always hated her, but now that money and inheritance were involved, her hatred had turned into something more dangerous. Masego knew she had to be careful. The next morning, Sindiswa suddenly changed her attitude. For the first time in years, she smiled at Masego. "Get dressed," she said sweetly. "I have a surprise for you." Masego blinked in confusion. A surprise? Sindiswa had never given her anything before, but before she could ask questions, Sindiswa handed her an old dress. "Come, my dear," she said, her voice unnaturally kind. "Let's go." Masego hesitated. Something didn't feel right, but when she glanced at her father's bedroom door, she knew she had no choice. He was too weak to protect her. If she refused to go, Sindiswa would only find another way to punish her. So, she followed. They walked for a long time, farther than Masego had ever gone before. The streets became quieter, the houses fewer. Soon, they reached the edge of town, where an old, abandoned building stood. Its windows were broken, and its walls were covered in cracks. Masego shivered. Something about this place felt wrong. Sindiswa turned to her with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Go inside," she said. "Your surprise is waiting." Masego hesitated. "What is it?" she asked softly. Sindiswa's smile faded. "Go inside," she repeated, her voice sharp. Masego's hands trembled as she stepped forward. The inside of the building was dark and cold. Dust covered the floor, and the air smelled of decay. She took another step, her heart pounding louder with every breath. Then, she heard movement behind her. Before she could turn around, Sindiswa's hands shoved her forward, hard. Masego screamed as she lost her balance. The world spun around her. For a brief moment, she felt weightless. And then, she was falling. Everything happened so fast. She hit something soft, but the impact still sent pain shooting through her body. She gasped, struggling to breathe, her head spinning. For a moment, she couldn't move. She lay there, surrounded by darkness, as Sindiswa's voice echoed from above. "It's over," Sindiswa muttered. "No one will find you here." Masego's heart broke. Her stepmother hadn't just wanted to get rid of her, she had wanted her dead. Then silence. Sindiswa was gone. Painfully, Masego tried to sit up. Her whole body ached, but somehow she was alive. When she looked around, she realized why. She had landed on a pile of old, discarded mattresses. If not for them, she might not have survived. Tears filled her eyes, but she refused to cry. She couldn't give up now, not when she had been given another chance. Somewhere in the distance, footsteps approached. A shadow appeared above her, a stranger, and for the first time in years, Masego felt something other than fear. Masego stood on the rooftop of the abandoned building, the wind whipping against her skin. Her heart pounded as she looked around, confused and afraid. Sindiswa had led her here with fake kindness, promising a surprise. But now, standing at the edge of the crumbling rooftop, Masego realized the truth. This was no surprise. This was a trap. Before she could react, Sindiswa's cold hand gripped her shoulder. "This is where it ends for you," Sindiswa hissed, her voice filled with hatred. Masego's breath caught in her throat. "Please, Mama Sindiswa," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Don't do this." Sindiswa let out a cruel laugh. "You are not my child. You never were. You are nothing but a burden, and I won't let you take what belongs to Kanya and me." Masego's eyes filled with tears. She had known Sindiswa hated her, but she never imagined she would go this far. She glanced over the edge. The ground was far below. If she fell, she wouldn't survive. "Sindiswa, please," she begged one last time. But Sindiswa didn't listen. With one powerful shove, she pushed Masego forward. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Masego's body tipped over the edge, her arms flailing as she tried to grab onto something, anything. But there was nothing to hold onto. The world blurred around her, the wind roaring in her ears as she plunged downward. She screamed. Then, impact. A sharp pain shot through her body as she crashed onto something soft. The air was knocked from her lungs, and darkness clouded her vision. She lay still, unable to move, her mind barely registering what had happened. She wasn't dead. Somehow, she had survived. After a few agonizing moments, she forced her eyes open. Beneath her was a pile of old discarded mattresses. They were dirty and worn, but they had saved her life. Without them, she would have been broken on the hard ground. Pain radiated through her body. Her arms ached, her legs felt numb, and her head throbbed. She tried to sit up, but collapsed back down, her breath ragged. Somewhere above, Sindiswa peered down from the rooftop. For a second, Masego thought she might climb down to finish what she started. But then, Sindiswa turned and disappeared. She thought Masego was dead. Tears streamed down Masego's face. Every part of her hurt, but her heart ached the most. The woman who was supposed to be her family had tried to kill her, and now she had no home, no one to turn to, and no way to get help. Her vision blurred, and the world began to fade. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, she heard footsteps approaching. A shadow appeared above her. A man knelt beside her, his face filled with concern. He had dark, kind eyes and strong hands that gently touched her bruised arm. "Are you alive?" His voice was deep, filled with worry. Masego tried to speak, but only a weak whisper came out. "Help me! I've got you!" the man said firmly. He carefully lifted her into his arms, holding her as if she were the most fragile thing in the world. As he carried her away from the abandoned building, Masego let herself close her eyes. She didn't know who this stranger was. She didn't know where he was taking her, but for the first time in a long time, she felt safe. Pain clouded her mind as she drifted in and out of consciousness. The last thing she remembered was falling, hitting something soft, and then the voice of a stranger. Now, there was warmth, a gentle touch, and the faint smell of herbs in the air. When her eyes finally fluttered open, she found herself lying on a bed in a small hut. A woven mat covered the floor, and the soft glow of a fire flickered in the corner. Every part of her body ached, but she was alive. A young man sat nearby, watching her with quiet concern. He leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "You're safe now. Rest." Confusion swirled in her mind, but exhaustion was stronger. Her body gave in, and she sank back into sleep. Days passed in a haze of pain and healing. An elderly woman, her face lined with wisdom, tended to her wounds. She spoke in a soothing voice, pressing warm cloths against her bruises and offering bitter-tasting herbal drinks. The kindness felt foreign, almost unreal. The young man, Tafari, stayed close. He had been the one to find her, the one to carry her broken body away from danger. His grandmother, Nomalanga, was the healer of their village, a place hidden deep within the forest, far from the cruelty she had escaped. Time moved slowly, each day filled with small victories, sitting up without dizziness, taking a few steps outside the hut, feeling the sun on her skin again. The village was peaceful, untouched by the outside world. Children ran barefoot through the fields, laughter echoing in the air. Women pounded maize while men carved wooden tools, their voices blending into the rhythm of daily life. Tafari became her guide, showing her the ways of the village. He taught her to weave baskets, to grind herbs, to listen to the whispers of the wind. Strength returned to her limbs, but the scars on her heart remained. At night, she lay awake, haunted by memories of betrayal, the push off the rooftop, the way Sindiswa had walked away without a second glance, the father who had once been her protector, now too weak to see the truth. Back in the town she had left behind, lies spread like wildfire. Sindiswa, with tears in her eyes, told everyone that the girl had run away. "She was always ungrateful," she sobbed to the neighbors. "I tried my best to raise her, but she chose to leave." Whispers filled the streets. Some pitied the grieving stepmother, others shook their heads, blaming the girl for bringing shame to the family. Banel, sick and frail, believed every word. His body had grown weaker, his mind clouded by illness. Sindiswa fed him lies along with his medicine, ensuring he never questioned her story. "She didn't want to stay," she told him softly. "We must move on." And so, the world forgot. But in the hidden village, strength was being rebuilt. The girl they thought was gone forever was healing, growing, preparing. Tafari saw the fire in her eyes, the determination that refused to be extinguished. "You are stronger than what happened to you," he told her one evening as they sat beneath the stars. She clenched her fists, feeling the weight of everything she had lost. "I won't let them win," she whispered. The past could not be erased, but the future was hers to reclaim. The sun rose over the quiet village, casting golden light across the small huts and open fields. The air smelled of fresh earth and wildflowers, carrying with it the sounds of life, children's laughter, birds singing, and the distant pounding of maize. It was a new day, another step toward healing. For weeks, she had been recovering, regaining the strength she had lost. At first, even standing had been difficult. Her body had been weak, her spirit shattered. But as time passed, the bruises faded, and so did the fear that had once controlled her. Tafari had been her guide through it all. His patience never wavered. Even on the days when frustration made her want to give up, he taught her the ways of the village, how to work with her hands, how to gather food, how to live in harmony with nature. But more than that, he taught her something even more valuable. "You are not just surviving," he told her one evening as they sat by the fire. "You are rebuilding. You are becoming who you were always meant to be." Those words stayed with her. Every morning, she woke up with a new sense of purpose. She helped Nomalanga with healing, learning about herbs and medicine. She watched how the old woman mixed dried leaves into powerful remedies, how she treated wounds with steady hands and a gentle heart. "You have a gift," Nomalanga told her one day as she watched closely, "not just for healing the body, but for understanding pain. One day, you will help many." She had never thought of herself as strong before. Sindiswa had spent years making her feel worthless, making her believe she would never be anything more than a servant, an unwanted stepdaughter. But here, in this quiet village, she was more than that. She was learning, growing, transforming. Tafari saw her determination and began teaching her things she had never known before. He brought books from a nearby town, helping her continue the education that had been stolen from her. At night, by the flickering light of a lantern, she traced the words on the pages, absorbing every lesson with hunger. Knowledge is power, he reminded her, and power is what will set you free. She studied relentlessly, determined to take back the future that had been denied to her. While others slept, she read. When others rested, she practiced the skills she was learning. She had been broken once, but she would never allow anyone to break her again. As the seasons changed, so did she. The timid girl who had arrived in the village, battered and afraid, was gone. In her place stood a young woman with fire in her heart and purpose in her soul. She had found strength not just in her body, but in her mind. Tafari saw the change in her. He noticed the way she carried herself now, no longer looking over her shoulder, no longer flinching at the mention of her past. She had grown into someone powerful, someone unbreakable. One day, as they stood by the river, he handed her a small wooden pendant. "A new identity," he said. "A new life. You are not just the girl they tried to destroy. You are more than your pain." She held the pendant tightly, feeling the weight of everything she had been through. She had spent her life being defined by others, by Sindiswa's cruelty, by her father's neglect, by a world that had looked the other way, but not anymore. She was free now. With Tafari's help, she began planning for the future. She gathered knowledge, honed her skills, and prepared for the day she would return, not as a victim, but as someone unstoppable. She was no longer the forgotten girl who had been thrown away. She was Masego, and she was ready to reclaim everything that had been stolen from her. Years had passed since the night she was left for dead. The girl who had once been helpless, abandoned and betrayed had disappeared. In her place stood a woman of strength, wisdom, and quiet power. Masego was no longer a victim. She had rebuilt herself, piece by piece, and now she was ready to return. Dressed in elegance, she stepped off the train as the city's lights flickered in the evening air. The place she once called home had changed, but so had she. As she walked through the familiar streets, memories whispered around her, ghosts of pain, echoes of suffering. But this time, she did not flinch. She was not the broken girl Sindiswa had tried to destroy. She was a woman with a mission. Sindiswa and Kanya had everything they had ever wanted: wealth, status, and a life of comfort. The house Masego had once been forced to scrub clean now stood as a symbol of their stolen success. They believed they had won, that no one would ever uncover the truth of what they had done. They were wrong. Masego had spent years preparing for this moment. She had gathered every piece of evidence, every lie Sindiswa had ever told, every fraudulent transaction, and every dark secret buried beneath the surface. She had spoken to people who had once doubted her, people who had begun to see Sindiswa for what she truly was, a woman who built her empire on deception and cruelty. Now, it was time for justice. That evening, she stood before the grand gates of the house she had once called home. The guards hesitated before letting her in. Her presence was commanding, undeniable. She walked through the lavish halls, taking in the luxury Sindiswa and Kanya had surrounded themselves with. Gold-trimmed furniture, sparkling chandeliers, expensive art hanging on the walls, all of it bought with stolen wealth, with lies. She found them in the dining room, laughing over an extravagant meal, unaware of the storm about to hit them. At first, Sindiswa didn't recognize her. The little girl she had abused was gone. In her place stood a woman of power, dressed in confidence, her eyes burning with purpose. But then, realization struck. Sindiswa's smile faded, her hands tightening around the silverware. "Masego," she whispered, disbelief in her voice. Kanya's eyes widened, her fork clattering against the plate. "No, it can't be." Masego stepped forward, her gaze unwavering. "Did you think I was gone forever?" Her voice was calm, steady, but filled with a quiet fury. "Did you think you could erase me?" Sindiswa forced a smile, trying to regain control. "You must have made a good life for yourself," she said smoothly. "There's no need for old grudges." "Old grudges." Masego's voice cut through the air like a blade. "You threw me away like I was nothing. You stole everything from me. My childhood, my education, my family. You left me to die." Sindiswa stiffened. "I don't know what you're talking about." Masego pulled out a folder and placed it on the table. "These say otherwise." The room fell silent. Sindiswa hesitated before opening the file, her fingers shaking as she flipped through the pages. Bank statements, legal documents, witness testimonies. Every secret she had buried was laid bare in front of her. This is fake," she stammered. but the panic in her eyes betrayed her. Masego leaned closer. You manipulated my father, stole his wealth, and when he got sick, you let him suffer while you lived in luxury. And when you saw me as a threat, you tried to get rid of me. Kanya swallowed hard, shifting uncomfortably. Mother, is this true? Sindiswa said nothing. Masego straightened, her voice like steel. You can deny it all you want, but the authorities won't. By this time tomorrow, your perfect little life will be over. The sound of sirens filled the air, growing louder with every second. Sindiswa's face drained of color as the front doors burst open. Officers swarmed in, moving quickly, their voices firm. She tried to protest, to beg, but the evidence was undeniable. As the handcuffs clicked around her wrists, she turned to Masego, her eyes wild with desperation. Please, you don't have to do this. Masego met her gaze, unshaken. You did this to yourself. As Sindiswa was dragged away, Kanya sat frozen, tears spilling down her face. The world she had known had crumbled in an instant. Everything she had taken for granted was gone. Masego watched in silence. She felt no joy in their downfall, only a quiet sense of closure. Walking away from the house, she took a deep breath. The past no longer held her captive. She had fought her way back, not for revenge, but for justice. The city stretched before her, full of new possibilities. She was free, finally, truly free. The truth had been hidden for years, buried beneath Sindiswa's lies. But now it was time for everything to come to light. Masego had waited for this moment, not out of revenge, but for justice. Her past had shaped her, but it would not define her. She was no longer a powerless girl. She was a woman who had reclaimed her strength. The day after Sindiswa's arrest, Masego visited her father, Banale. He had grown weaker over the years, his once strong body now frail. Time had not been kind to him, and illness had drained the life from his eyes. He sat in his chair by the window, staring blankly at the city outside, unaware of the storm that had just unraveled. When Masego entered, he turned slowly, his tired eyes narrowing in confusion. At first, he did not recognize her. She had been gone for so long, and the woman standing before him looked nothing like the child he had once known. But then, realization struck. Masego. His voice was barely a whisper, as if saying her name would make her disappear again. She nodded, stepping closer. It's me, Baba. His hands trembled as he reached for her, disbelief and guilt clouding his expression. They told me you ran away. His voice cracked. I searched for you, but they said you didn't want to come back. Masego swallowed the lump in her throat. How many times had she dreamed of this moment, of her father finally seeing the truth? But now, standing before him, she felt a deep sadness. He had been blind for so long, believing Sindiswa's lies while she suffered. Baba, she said gently, I never ran away. Sindiswa tried to kill me. His body stiffened. What? She took me to an abandoned building and pushed me off the roof. She left me to die. The words hung heavy in the air, each one slicing through the silence. She lied to you. She stole from you. She made sure you were too sick and weak to see what was happening. Tears filled his eyes, his breath coming in sharp gasps. No, that can't be true. He shook his head as if trying to fight against reality. Sindiswa, she wouldn't. But even as he said the words, doubt crept into his voice. Deep down, he had always known something wasn't right. He had just been too weak to question it. Masego sat beside him, her voice steady. The police have arrested her, Baba. They have all the evidence. Fraud, attempted murder, everything. She will never hurt anyone again. Banal buried his face in his hands. Years of betrayal, guilt, and regret crashed over him like a tidal wave. He had failed to protect his daughter. He had let the wrong person control his life, and now he had to face the consequences of his blindness. I'm so sorry, my child, he whispered. I should have protected you. Masego placed a hand over his. You were sick. She took advantage of you. But now, it's over. Tears streamed down his face. He had lost so much. His daughter, his health, and now the woman he had trusted. But for the first time in years, the weight of Sindiswa's lies was lifting. Meanwhile, in another part of the city, Kanya sat alone in the grand house that had once been filled with luxury and comfort. The world she had known had crumbled overnight. Her mother, the woman she had admired, was in prison. Their wealth, their status, everything was gone. For the first time in her life, she felt what it was like to have nothing. She had spent years looking down on Masego, treating her as if she was beneath her. But now, she was the one left behind. The friends who had once surrounded her disappeared. The people who used to praise her mother now whispered about her downfall. She had never thought about the consequences of their cruelty. But now, abandoned and alone, she understood. Masego had every reason to hate her. She had been cruel, selfish, and blind to the truth. But when she finally saw her again, she expected anger. She expected revenge. Instead, Masego simply looked at her with quiet strength. "You never had to be like her," Masego said softly. "You had a choice." Kanya lowered her gaze, shame burning in her chest. She had spent her whole life being her mother's shadow. Believing Sindiswa's love made her special. But in the end, it had only left her empty. Masego didn't stay long. She had no interest in punishing Kanya further. Life had already done that. As she walked away, she felt no bitterness, no resentment. She had fought for justice, not revenge. Sindiswa would pay for her crimes. Her father had finally seen the truth. And Kanya, whether she changed or not, would have to live with the weight of her choices. For Masego, the past no longer held power over her. She had won, not by destroying others, but by rising above them. Karma had done its work, and now she was free. The storm had passed. The pain, the betrayal, the suffering, it was all behind her now. Masego had fought battles no child should ever face, had been broken, abandoned, and left for dead. But she had survived, and survival was not enough. She had risen, stronger than ever, not just for herself, but for those who needed her. The city no longer felt like a place of fear. She walked through its streets with her head held high, no longer a forgotten girl, but a woman who had carved her own path. The whispers of the past no longer haunted her. They only reminded her of how far she had come. She had taken back her power, her dignity, and her future. But she knew that there were still many like her. Girls trapped in homes filled with cruelty, voices silenced by fear, dreams crushed before they even had a chance to grow. She could not change the past, but she could change the future. With the wealth she had built and the connections she had made, Masego opened a foundation for abused and abandoned children. It became a sanctuary for those who had nowhere else to go, a place where they could feel safe, learn, and rebuild their lives. She personally guided them, teaching them that pain did not define them, that they were more than their scars. Every time she saw a child smile for the first time after years of suffering, she knew she was fulfilling her purpose. Every girl who found her voice, every boy who dared to dream again, reminded her why she had fought so hard. One day, as she stood before a group of young girls, she told them, "The world tried to break me, just as it tried to break you, but we are not weak. We are not victims. We are survivors. And one day, you will stand where I stand now, ready to lift others the way I lift you." Her words became a beacon of hope. Survivors from all over the country came to her foundation, sharing their stories, finding healing in each other. The name Masego, once whispered in sorrow, was now spoken with admiration and respect. Despite everything that had been done to her, she chose not to live with hatred. Forgiveness did not mean forgetting, nor did it mean excusing those who had wronged her. It meant freeing herself from the chains of bitterness. Sindiswa was in prison, paying for her crimes. Kanya had been left to face the emptiness of a life built on lies, and her father, though filled with regret, had finally seen the truth before it was too late. Masego carried no anger for them anymore. They had tried to destroy her, but they had only made her stronger. Now she lived life on her own terms. She traveled, studied, and continued to grow. She built friendships with people who saw her worth, who lifted her up instead of tearing her down. She stood tall, not just as a woman who had survived, but as a woman who had won. Her story spread far and wide, inspiring countless others to rise above their struggles. She was living proof that kindness, courage, and determination could overcome even the darkest of pasts. On the anniversary of the day she had escaped death, she stood on the rooftop of a tall building, looking down at the city lights below. She closed her eyes, feeling the wind against her skin. The same sky that had once witnessed her fall now watched her rise. She had been a victim. She had been a survivor. Now she was victorious.